everyone. My name is Rahul and I lead payment APIs at PayPal. Today I'm going to talk to you some of the best practices that I've used over the years in building APIs and building products focused at developers. With that, let's just jump right in. So those of us who've been building APIs for a while, the process typically starts in most cases with us realizing that there is a business opportunity that could be solved using APIs. We put together some sort of a strategy document or a product document that outlines the benefits. And then you get into a point where you're engaging with your engineers, with your engineering team. And that's when, depending on which company you're working at, you choose the path of designing the API first, taking it through a Swagger spec, and then getting into a coding mode. Or some of them start out with the code first, just finish the whole thing, try to get as close to market as possible, and then get into documenting it. So they see specs as a way to document the code as opposed to a design artifact. What I've seen happen in practice really is teams who have, let's say, a lot of engineers or a lot of spec capacity pretty much start working on both of them at start. So they do code and they do specs and try to keep it in sync so that they can deliver things faster. So depending on where you are in the debate, you could start with code, you could start with spec, you could do both of them in parallel. And that's a debate that probably will never end in this industry. But the point I'm trying to get to is even if you do all of these things, or if you follow a process of designing first and go to spec later, there still might be gaps when you actually launch the product. And the gaps are formed because even if you build the right API, what you're really aiming for is what's going to be the end developer experience when they integrate. Because in a lot of instances, your API might not be the only API that they integrate with. And so I think thinking through steps in integration and having your API be a part of it is really what I'm going to convince you to do going forward. So let's talk about how one could achieve it. So what I'm proposing today is don't start with specs, don't start with code, but write the docs first. And this seems contrary to how a lot of folks have been building APIs or products focused on developers, where they try to get things to market and the documentation and the integration guide being the last step in the process. What I'm encouraging you to think is really think backwards, right? Start with what would that integration experience be, right? What would they have to do to integrate with your API? What's the use cases that they're working with? And think of it from an end user perspective. And then continue to refine that into a detailed Swagger spec and then ultimately into a code. So the idea behind working backwards and doing docs first is really to have a low fidelity integration doc upfront before you even start the spec. And let me get into what are the benefits of doing it, what are some of the pros and cons. But that's the central idea that I wanted to communicate out. Docs first, specs later, and code at the end. So here is what I have seen as potential benefits in doing so. So one is having that integration guide, right, serves as a constant reminder of the product you're building and for whom you're building. If you're writing specs for an API, a lot of times you get deep into the mechanics of the API design, and you might lose sight of who you're actually building the product for, or what type of developer you're building the product for. And the second is integrations don't exist in isolation. Maybe your developers that you're targeting or the companies that you're targeting integrating with your APIs use your API in conjunction with other APIs that your company provides, or they use it in conjunction with APIs of other companies. It's having a good sense of where your API fits into that life cycle, or where does it fit into what the developers or the companies that your APIs are being picked up by use is really important. And having that integration guide serves you as a reminder of where does your API fit in their development lifecycle or in the user lifecycle. If you work for a large company that builds a lot of APIs, having a developer viewpoint gets a lot of disparate teams aligned because they see how each of the building blocks fits into the wider goal that developers at your company is targeting benefit from. Otherwise, you end up working in silos and you might build great building blocks, but something or the other, they don't really gel as well they should. It also facilitates a lot of conversation about architecture and design upfront because now you actually have a doc that you could uh, share it with your professional services or your sales organization. It also aids in you being able to compare with how your competitors have laid out the steps. It might help you find whether your API or your integration needs a few extra steps that your competitor doesn't, and trying to then get into why that might be the case. It allows also for a lot of feedback to be written or received even before a single line of code is written. Now, specs is an amazing way to get feedback. Right? We've all done our part in writing the spec and sharing it out for feedback. But for a non-technical audience who are not used to looking at a Swagger spec, a simple integration guide with some curl snippets provide a lot more insight into how you're doing than dumping an API spec that's under revision onto them. It also is something that product managers who are not technically savvy or may not get into the details of API design could easily write up having chatted with the technical leads. So it's a low fidelity doc that can be a conversation starter as opposed to a spec which then sort of gets into the nitty gritty of design. So this is what I see as key potential benefits that I've observed in trying to starting with a docs first approach rather than a code first or a spec first. So just a couple of reminders of what it is not. A lot of teams do operate in some mode or the other when it comes to doing a little bit of docs first. So a couple of things to note is that this isn't your replacement for a formal integration guide. A formal integration guide that you put on your developer portal or if you're sending it as a PDF, that's a well-matured document that has a lot of finer details about your product. That's not what this is. It's not a replacement, or it's not about just writing more quotes or comments in your code, right? So it's not about writing code and putting comments. This is a separate doc that exists outside of your code. It's also not about having your documentation work with you when you're writing code. That should always be a good practice to follow. But this is about doing the things and writing the doc even before you get into the code. It's also not a great substitute for what a lot of teams follow, which is a test-driven development or an acceptance test-driven development or a behavior test-driven development. It's called various names and have various nuances, but that's not what this is. It's not about also writing a README. A lot of engineers start writing a README, and that serves as a reminder for what they're building. The idea of this doc is to mimic the steps as you would see in an integration guide at the end of the project, but just doing it upfront. So it's just to remind that if one of these things is a team following and you feel like, oh, well, we are already doing it, just a check mark for you that it isn't about doing what's listed here, but having a change in thinking of writing an integration guide upfront. So a couple of lines that your companies might benefit from this approach, right? Or you might benefit from this approach. A lot of times, especially in big organizations, a lot of gaps do get discovered when you actually write the integration guide. You've done your spec, you've done your coding, now you're putting together a guide for a use case that you essentially build an API for. And when you're writing it, you realize, oh, well, why do I have this? Could this two API calls be one API call, right? Discovering that at the end of the journey is going to be really, really difficult because you might have an idea of building fine-grained APIs, but when you actually put it together in a doc, it just feels like too long. And that's what your developers that you're trying to attract want. So that could be a sign that you might want to consider doing at least some of it upfront. You might have API teams, as I mentioned before, who are building APIs in silos. It's to not say that APIs should not form building blocks that you could combine together, but without getting a view of how it would look when put together, you're essentially building APIs in parallel. You're hoping that the governance that your company has in place will take care of ensuring consistency between the two APIs, but that's not going to be enough. It's only when you put things together you realize that there are problems. There could also be concerns where the product comes across as built by completely different teams. You might define something in your API which is defined slightly differently in another API. These are the sort of challenges you don't really get to view until everything is built. So I think an integration doc upfront may try to alleviate some of these challenges. You could also have a lot of professional services engineers trying to support your product. And that could be because the challenges or the complexity that introducing your APIs demand a bigger professional services organization, where someone needs to find a way to put together because they were not built in a way that they could put together. It could also be that you have tried spec first and code next, but for some reason that's only taking you so far. And so this would be a good way to maybe think about things a little bit differently. And you also notice that even though everything is built and everything is documented, at the end of the day, you just are not as good as your competitors. It's going to be too late in the game because the only real way you're going to compare yourself with competitors is look at your integration guide and theirs and say, look, are we just as easier? Are we just as better? Doing it at each building block level is always going to be tricky. So some of the things to think about if you notice that these are the problems that your company faces on a regular basis, maybe docs-driven development and thinking about things backwards is what your API team needs at this point of time. So where does it fit into an overall product process? So most, although it might seem waterfall, each company has a way of doing things, but what I would want to encourage is before you get into a design, before you get into specs upfront, that's when you sort of have a version of your integration guide, which I refer to as docs-driven development, created. And towards the end of the life cycle, when you're ready to deploy and launch, that's when you refine those docs further into integration guides that you launch. So the journey really starts once you pass discovery and you're into design, and you're like, okay, I know what I need to build. I know the problem. How should we think about the experience? And towards the end, you sort of refine it further. The idea of all of this really starts with embracing the idea of developers as your customers. Because if you don't think of them as customers, if you're just trying to get an integration out there to build some businesses need, then you're going to cobble together whatever solution one can think of in the limited time that you have. So this does need a little bit of a disciplined approach, starting with thinking of your developers as customers, because that's the persona that you're going to build or keep in mind as you're putting the integration guide. The integration guide is meant for them, and so you have to be able to relate to them as your customers, and only then you could actually put together something that's meaningful. Now, developers as customers is an easy enough concept, but I think it's also important to peel the onion a little bit, because maybe you're trying to build an API to really compete with your competitor, right? And so if you are in an industry where it's not growing a lot, and the only way you're growing is by taking customers away from your competitor, maybe you're trying to build something that's closer to what your competitor already has, because then the migration from that API to yours is easier. But unless you know that, right, you're not going to think about your APIs in that way. And if you put together a doc, that's when you could actually compare and say, look, here is how you integrate with a competitor, here is how you would integrate with us, and here is why the steps are so similar. So I think it's also important to get into the persona of the developer, because you might be targeting a developer who's just migrating from your competitor to you, or you might be working with a developer who actually doesn't need your API but just needs a widget that's powered by your API. So depending on what your customer needs are, that will help flush out and help you think about what is an integration story. And maybe in your integration story, it's just a widget that's powered by your API, not even your API, right? Just thinking about a developer experience upfront and thinking about who your customers are will help you refine those ideas. A typical template that I tend to follow is you have a goal for what you're trying to help a developer do. In taking an example, it could be accepting payment using PayPal. You could make certain assumptions because you don't want to start the document right from a developer signing up to you, getting your credentials. So it could be like, hey, I'm presuming that a developer signed up has the credentials. And that's when you sort of lay out your integration steps. They are typically could be in a fetch and access token, a short description, a little bit of code snippet, display the PayPal button, and if you're accepting money using PayPal, again, a little bit of description and code snippet. So the idea is to have a low fidelity document that sort of outlines, what is it that you're trying to achieve or what your developer wants to achieve, and then some short steps that leads to the potential solution so that you can visualize all the interactions and all the touch points that the developer would have to take to be able to successfully integrate it with. The key difference between a doc like this and design and discovery versus launch is that the primary goal in the design and discovery phase is to really think backwards, do a competitive analysis, get feedback. As opposed to launch, when things are done and dusted, you're really trying at that point to aid the developers to integrate with your product. And your hope is by that time, everything is polished, you've got the feedback you need, and so you're ready to launch with a more high fidelity version. In your design and discovery, you might not have all the fields in your API, but you certainly have a good sense of what your API endpoints are, right? When it comes to the end state, it's all more fleshed out. As you're writing, the key to remember is that this is low fidelity in the design phase, right? So you don't need sequence diagrams, you don't need an overview, you don't need fancy images to explain because the audience, for most parts, understand what you're trying to do. The idea is still that you need to think about who the persona is. You still need a little bit of code snippet, but the key thing to remember is the goal here is to sort of aid your own internal understanding of what you're trying to build, who you're building for, and get early feedback and find a way to compare with your competitors. And then use that as a springboard during launch to further refine it, add more details, and make it production ready. So that's the key difference, as I would call. This is often a source of confusion when you start this process in your company because folks just know the integration guides that they see on your website or your developer portal. They just don't know what a version of this internally could look like. So if you're starting this afresh, I would say maybe try to put a sample doc together that sort of uses a template that I've showed so that developers and your other team members have an idea of what a low fidelity integration guide looks like. Now, when you start on this journey, you're going to certainly find a lot of people who would talk about, look, how can you document something before you even build it? You wanted an API yesterday. I don't think I can follow all this process. A lot of engineers might also complain that I'm not a good writer, so I'm not, don't feel comfortable writing a doc. That's best left to doc writers. So there are a lot of questions that might come up. The answers to them, quite honestly, vary with the company you work with, the kind of culture you have. What I want to encourage you is to think about these problems and think about these problems in the context of your organization and the team that you work with, because having answers to these questions in your mind will help alleviate some of the initial pushback that you might get in adopting some of these practices. With that, I wish you all the best in building your APIs. I know how hard it is to build an API, get it out in the market, make it successful. And the last thing you want to really build is build one that doesn't really resonate with the developers, or you have to keep making too many versions to get it right. This is a way to alleviate some of the challenges that you might experience in doing so. I hope this was useful. If you have further questions, feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn or use the Calendly link to set up time with me. Always love to chat with people on APIs and how we could make things better together. Take care. Bye. Hey guys, I'm Rahul. This session was pre-recorded, but I thought I would join you for a live Q&A. You'll see a chat or a Q&A on the right side of the screen. So if you have any questions, drop them there and I can help answer them. I see two questions already, so I'm going to try and answer them. First one is from Miles about, is documentation still worth it if you only have technical people on a team? I would say absolutely, and I'll tell you a reason why. I'm working on an initiative now with two teams. One is building like an iOS SDK, Android, and another one building in JavaScript. They work in completely different Scrum teams, and the doc that each one of them produces help us compare how the integration might look depending on the platform you're working with, right? So even within engineers, something like this really does help aid an understanding of what each team is trying to build, because that's something that they can easily understand, right? A JS engineer might not fully appreciate the nuances of iOS, but when they look at the doc and they're like, okay, this is how an SDK is behaving, they get it immediately. So I think it certainly helps. With regards to the level of information you would put in, look, it really depends, right? If you have something that's already built, or you have an idea what it might look like, add in the snippet. The idea is that you would start with a doc that maybe has just endpoints to your API, and as you sort of mature, you add more information if you think it adds value to it. The goal isn't to try to recreate the spec, but to really think about how different parts could be linked together, or how different APIs could be joined together to make something that is useful to a customer. So add in the details if you need to, but I just start typically with steps and maybe endpoints, and then that gives you enough idea of what something might do, and then just go from there. Um, the other question, yeah, this comes back from Stu about how do you sort of embed why you did something as part of the API spec. I think that sounds like a cool idea. I remember I've been working and owning some APIs that I built from ground up, and I know every single thing that was put into the API, and so I'm sort of a walking repository of knowledge when it comes to all that. And I wish there was some way to sort of codify some of the reasoning behind it. I think at some point, it doesn't matter. It is what it is as it's documented. If there are some new things that have come up, you should look at it from fresh perspective. But yeah, I mean, something to look for. I don't have a good answer to how you could sort of embed that and have machine readable user stories. Maybe, that's part of the spec evolution that we could think about hey, as to the background behind adding this. And Stuart, thanks. I know, thanks for your wonderful comments. If there are any more questions, guys, feel free to reach out to me on my Calendly link or look me up on LinkedIn. Always have to chat about all things API. On a closing note, I do want to call out that implementing it within an organization has its challenges for sure. Teams do need to get used to it. I've sort of been through the pain points. So I would start small, start with a team that's closest to you and try to spread it across the organization. This is a work in progress for me. I have been learning from a lot of other teams that have used it. And so this is sort of an assimilation of all the things that I've learned in trying to do so. And hopefully, I'll come back to you guys in a year to see if there's something more that I have learned along the way. But thanks so much, and let's stay in touch.